So you all may remember in 1962, John Kennedy held a very successful state visit to France. And Mrs. Kennedy was enormously popular. And at the farewell dinner, the closing dinner, in front of de Gaulle and others, JFK said, "I used to be the President of the United States, but now I am simply the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris. I'm the man who accompanied Eddie Glaude to New Orleans, where this is like Saddam's Baghdad. His picture's everywhere. Have y'all noticed this? It's just everywhere. So I'm going to start with a serious question. You wrote a marvelous book about Baldwin and what he meant in real time and can mean to us. So give us your origin story with Baldwin. When did you first read him? When did he become so vital to you?
Well, first of all, thank you for the question. And you see how he lies? This is Jon Meacham.
Lie.
Right?
I just, you know,
telling the truth. You're going to pull out your
I
cigar?
got a sedan. Yeah, I got a
get your
cigar here.
Okay, my cigar.
Eddie is a cigar man. It's the only good thing about going to Morehouse,
Yeah,
apparently.
Can you imagine this guy? But we're not going to smoke it. So my serious encounter with Baldwin, John, is actually in graduate school. You would think I would have read him in high school. I went to high school on the coast of Mississippi, so we can tell that story on another day. At Morehouse, I was kind of avoiding him in some ways. And in college, in graduate school, I was an Ellison man. I wrote most of my first-year graduate papers on Ralph Ellison.
Interesting.
I didn't want to deal with Baldwin because he made my colleagues, he made their faces turn red. They went flush as they read him because he was telling the truth in some ways. So I really didn't begin to have this serious encounter with him until I started teaching him. So my first job was at Bowdoin College in Maine, Brunswick, Maine, and I taught Fire Next Time every year. And then I started teaching No Name in the Street. And then suddenly he began to open up, and he became in some ways a muse for me. Let me ask you this question.
Yes, sir.
You had the honor of writing.
Appearing with you. Aside from that.
This is what we have to go through on the set of Morning Joe. You know.
Sorry.
No, actually we don't, because he's in his studio at home. But
That's
anyway,
right.
You had the honor of talking with John Lewis in his last days as you were working on the biography. Talk a little bit about that experience.
Well, I first met John Lewis during the last election in 1992. That cycle, there was a Georgia Senate runoff. And it's a little like Georgia's become the new Louisiana. Y'all always are having elections down here. And Georgia was having it. And on an election night, if you're a politician or a journalist, you tend to want to give the impression that you're off doing important things, right? What you're really doing is eating the same cheese cubes, but in a different room. But you want to give the impression of that. And so Wyche Fowler was running against Paul Coverdale, and I was covering it for the Chattanooga Times, my hometown newspaper. And I walked into the ballroom in Atlanta, and there was John Robert Lewis and Lillian, just standing there among the people. He was a senior congressman, already, the civil rights monument in many ways. And it began an unfolding conversation that, as Eddie kindly says, didn't really stop until about a week before he died, on July 17th of 2020. And one of the things I had to fight in that relationship was treating John Lewis as the acceptable kind of black guy that someone like me would like.
Right, I remember
Right?
this.
I sometimes call it the easy listening version of the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
Right? Because John, even in the beginning, in 1966, at Kingston Springs, Tennessee, not far from where I live, Stokely Carmichael and John Lewis went to battle over different approaches to the same end in many ways. And Jon was seen as, somebody with Dr. King. It was a Sunday school version. It was nonviolent. It was too accommodationist. One of the SNCC leaders who was siding with Stokely Carmichael said the problem with John Lewis after 1963 was every time President Johnson called, John would send his suit to the cleaners and then get on a plane. So he was seen as too much a part of the establishment that was trying to be shifted. But ultimately the way I resolved that, if I did successfully, was through the language of the Southern Church,
Right.
of which I'm a part in the broadest sense. I'm not a very good Christian, as Robert Louis Stevenson said. The duty of the Christian is not to succeed, but to fail cheerfully. If so, I'm the most cheerful guy you'll ever encounter. But he was on that bridge. He was on the Freedom Rides. He was in Nashville, coming out of American Baptist Theological Seminary, a tiny school still there. The fancy kids went to Morehouse. John and Bernard Lafayette and James Bevel went to this. There were 100 students. Imagine that. There's a little school with 100 students on the Cumberland River in Nashville, produced John Lewis, James Bevel, ultimately Diane Nash, though she was at Fisk. It's just an incredible story. But what I realized watching him and talking to him in those, I guess almost 30 years, right? I hadn't even thought about that. As he was in the House, and as he became, and to me, this is one of the most fascinating things about John Lewis, is he became a kind of walking monument. Mm-hmm. He was kind of in the anniversary business, right? He took congressional delegations back every year to Selma. If you needed something on an anniversary, he was always there. And he's the only public figure I've ever known who could be at a scene of his great triumphs that should have been all about him. And yet it was the most egoless, unself-referential thing you can imagine, which is hard to do, right? So you would be standing on the Pettus Bridge with him, but it really wasn't about him, even though you were there because of him. And that was a kind of charisma in the purest sense of the Greek word. It was a gift from the gods that, as an old teacher of mine at Sewanee once said, one definition of charm is the capacity to make other people love you without their quite knowing why. And somehow or another, that's what Jon did.
It's fascinating to talk about Selma. Selma is so complicated.
Yeah.
As we talked about this as you were working through that section in the book in some ways, right? That there are 3 marches. In some ways, and when I think about Baldwin, the complexity of Selma is almost evidenced in his witness. There is Bloody Sunday. Then there's the march that King gets up and turns around.
Right.
And SNCC folk are saying, oh, the Lord. They're going to sing.
He didn't bother to show up on Bloody Sunday, and then when he does come, he obeys the federal judge.
Right, and then they sing, ain't nobody going to turn us around.
Yeah.
And then the 3rd march, of course, is when everyone comes. And in between, there's all sorts of violence. And a lot of SNCC folk, they leave, they get angry, they go organize in Lowndes County, Alabama. Typically, we tell the story of Selma in this uncomplicated way, probably because Jesse Jackson, that was his first serious one. And the way in which we tell it kind of flattens out the complexity of the moment, because Baldwin is going to identify with those young folk in an interesting sort of way, even though he absolutely loved and adored King.
Well, it is flattened out. And I actually teach this. We think of Tulane as the Vanderbilt of Louisiana, so thank you all for having me.
Throw the rocks that way.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Princeton. Did you get your passport stamped on the way down? How does this work? So The way the story is told, right? I mean, if we were watching this on PBS, you have Lewis and Hosea Williams coming across the bridge at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, slate gray afternoon, Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965. Wind is blowing. John's wearing his overcoat. In his backpack is a copy of Richard Hofstadter's The American Political Tradition, an apple, an orange, and a toothbrush, because he expected to be arrested. And so that was the rule. James Lawson taught him, you always take a book, some fruit, and a toothbrush. And they go to, John Clouds, the major, he says, this is an illegal march. John says, may I have a word? They say there's no word to be had. They kneel to pray as their knees hit the asphalt. The troopers come, the tear gas. People think, by the way, that one of the reasons everybody was throwing up was because of the tear gas. It was because they were concussed. That was why. And then famously, ABC is playing the first broadcast version of Judgment at Nuremberg. So Frank Reynolds breaks in that night with a bulletin. It was the first significant news bulletin to be broken in since Dallas in 63. This is March of 65. And then what's the next scene? It's LBJ, right? Giving the great Richard Goodwin speech. That moment, there are moments in the life of a nation where history and fate intersect to form a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was at Lexington and Concord, so it was at Appomattox, so it was last week at Selma, Alabama. And we shall overcome. And then the Voting Rights Act is signed, and then everything's fine. Right? Whoops. So one of the ways I teach this is Johnson's speech was on March 15th. Bloody Sunday was March 7th. 8 days is a long time. So what happened in those 8 days? A lot of the politics that Baldwin captured, that Eddie's talking about, but also Lyndon Johnson asserted control over the entire situation. So two things happened. One is he forces King to go to Judge Frank Johnson and follow the court orders about the nature of the march. And in what I think is one of the most important moments in modern American history, because the lesson of it, I think, lives on, he summons George Wallace to the Oval Office. LBJ had very deep cushions on the couch, so the person would sink and LBJ would loom. He was in the rocking chair, and he leans over George Wallace, and Wallace says, well, I can't control voting boards, or something. And Johnson says wonderfully, don't shit me, George Wallace. And then he says, George, this is not about 1968. It's not about 1988. It's about history. And when you die, do you want a pine scratch, stony grave that says, George Wallace, he hated? Or do you want a beautiful, elegant granite monument that says, George Wallace, he built? And that's the fundamental question, it seems to me, of citizenship, is do you want to hate or do you want to build? And one of the things that Eddie and I debate offline a good bit is the extent to which, and I'm right, by the way, in this debate, just so you know, the extent to which progress is A, measured, and B, celebrated. And so talk a little bit about that.
One of the things that I insist on in our conversations is that while white America is deliberating between whether or not it's going to hate or build, we have to raise our babies. Mm-hmm. While you're trying to decide what kind of human being you're going to be, whether or not you're going to be monstrous, we have to protect ourselves. We have to figure out how to raise our children in a society that fundamentally despises them. And so the task then becomes, or the question rather, isn't whether or not we're going to hate or whether we're going to build. The question is whether or not we allow hatred and anger and rage to overwhelm our moral sense. And so when we think about this moment, Because there's this moment, remember when the young folk, when SNCC goes into Lowndes County, Alabama, and they argue for political self-determination, they use the symbol of what? The Black Panther as a symbol of the Lowndes County Black Party, right? Mm-hmm. And so we tend to think of the Black Panther Party as October 1966 in Oakland, California. But the first image of the Black Panther comes in Lowndes County, Alabama. And so we hear cries after the March Against Fear. Stokely Carmichael says, I've been to jail X number of times. I'm not going to jail anymore. No more freedom now. We want what? Black power. And so this ongoing battle of how do we respond in the gap between will you hate or will you build? What kind of human being will we be? How will we raise our babies? What will we do in the interim as you make those decisions? And oftentimes we have the debate about the pace of progress, right? What the pace of the progress? How long, Jimmy would ask, and I'm paraphrasing here, how long must we wait for your progress? Do we have to lose another George Floyd for your progress? Do we have to lose our own babies as we wait on your progress? What do we do in the interim while we fix up? Because there's a story to be told from the vantage point of Lyndon Baines Johnson, but then there's the story to be told from the vantage point of those Black folk who bore the burden and the brutality of what was happening in the midst of the high political drama in the White House. So Jimmy Baldwin was always committed to the idea of the New Jerusalem, that we were always engaged. Is that rain? I'm from here, I know that kind of rain. I'm like, that's when you pull over on the side of the highway and just wait for it to come.
I knew John Barry was going to bring a flood.
So the question becomes, Baldwin is always committed to the idea of a New Jerusalem, but he insisted, and I want to insist, and I don't want to have to echo his voice, that in order for that to happen, we have to grow up and confront ourselves honestly about who we are as a nation, that is.
So my argument back is that I'm not asking anybody to wait till we, broadly put, get our house in order. I think this is a description of human nature and a perennial struggle between light and dark and good and bad that unfolds in our individual lives and then in a democracy in the fullness of the nation itself, because a democracy is largely, not entirely, but largely the fullest manifestation of our individual dispositions of heart and mind. And those dispositions of heart and mind give it just enough force and just enough focus to create the rule of law. And so that's one slight amendment I would propose. One of my favorite lines of Baldwin's comes from when he's writing about SNCC in Florida. I want to say it's Tallahassee.
Right, this is a Nobody Knows My Name, right.
All right. And he says somebody asked, there'd been a sit-in. What was a sit-in, I think? He said, someone asked me, and you have this vision, writers know this, you have this vision of Baldwin back in the motel with his typewriter, right? Filing the piece. It may have been Esquire, I can't remember who he wrote for on that. But he wrote this, he said, people ask, what got into these kids? America is what got into these kids. So what was Baldwin's and the Glaudian definition of America in that sense?
Madness.
Madness.
Yes. Madness in a Renaissance, in the sense of the Renaissance, not a clinical sense of madness, right? What is madness in this sense, right? There's this refusal to live the truth, to live in this false sense that we believe that we are the shining city on the hill, to use Reagan's kind of adjective on John Winthrop's description.
And Jesus.
And, but Augustine, we can name everybody.
He approved, can I interrupt you? Your very important point to
Yes.
tell a quick story. So, I know this is important. We'll get back to the important stuff in a second. But, so Reagan, and this is, and Eddie and I have discussions about President Reagan.
Yeah.
There's called spats, if we were married. Can you do that in Louisiana now? Probably not. Anyway, so the Reagan's phrase, shining city on a hill, is adding the adjective to a line from the Sermon on the Mount, right? Jesus said it should be as a city upon a hill, and its light shall not be hid. Reagan did that so well that I've actually heard ministers, true story, from pulpit say, as Jesus said, America shall be as a city, a shining city upon a hill. And I never knew President Reagan, but I did know Mrs. Reagan a little bit. As Jimmy Stewart said, if Ronnie had married Nancy the first time, he would have won an Academy Award. But I heard this, and so I was at lunch where I would eat and she wouldn't. And I said, ma'am, I just heard a minister say, this is, it's amazing. President Reagan improved on Jesus. And she looked and she said, well, yes, that's the kind of thing Ronnie did a lot. May someday we all be loved as Nancy Davis loved Ronald Reagan. Now go back to Baldwin.
I don't believe that. Y'all believe that? No, I'm just kidding.
How could I make that up?
So part of this idea that we are the shining city on the hill, that we're the Redeemer nation, that we're an example of democracy achieved, that particular illusion stands in or keeps us from confronting who we actually are.
Sure.
And so there's a kind of falseness that we live in that blinds us to the truth of who we are. We know this intimately in the South, right? And this is what Eugene O'Neill is trying to get at in Ice Man Cometh. This is what the No Chance Saloon is all about. This is Blanche and Streetcar Named Desire, right? What does it mean to imagine oneself in a particular sort of way, right? And to evade what is looking back in the mirror, right? Looking back at you in the mirror. So there's a kind of madness where what has gotten into these young folk? Well, the madness of America has gotten into them. It is a madness that calls forth in interesting sorts of ways, a kind of madness.
Well, let me push you on that, because but my sense of that sentence from Baldwin is that it's a good thing that what was getting into them in protesting, in seeking justice, was the aspirational element which creates one pole as to which there is this gap you talk about.
So I don't really read that sentence in that way, that the motivation for these young folk to act is a kind of aspirational claim about America as it could be.
Right.
I think it's Baldwin is constantly saying, right, when you think about, particularly when he's at Howard, how I open up the book. He's at Howard in an apartment with many of the young activists, right? There were these various cliques. You had the AAU Center grouping of folk, Julian Bond and those folk. You had the Fisk Nashville group. So that's the Atlanta group over here. The Fisk Nashville group. Yep. That's Diane Nash, John Lewis and those folk. And then you had the DC folk, NAG, right? This is Stokely Carmichael. This Muriel Tillinghast. Those folk, right?
Marion Barry.
Marion Barry. Marion Barry was the first president of SNCC. People don't remember this, right? And so they're in this apartment building. No liquor can be found, so somebody knew a bootlegger, so they went out and got some bootleg scotch. And they're going at it at the top of, till the sun comes up. And Baldwin sees in their eyes exhaustion. These are the young people who believed wholeheartedly in nonviolent discrimination, nonviolent protest. Stokely Carmichael said he never broke nonviolent discipline but once. It was when the police attacked Dr. King. The so-called Black Power, said he never broke nonviolence but once. And then Stokely says, America made these young people. Baldwin says, America made these young people. So I want to connect these two formulations, right? One is not just simply kind of aspirational. It's a description of the context out of which these young folk act. courageously, if that makes sense.
It does. It does.
But I want to ask you a question. You wrote the biography of H.W. Bush, President Bush.
Yep.
You just cited Nancy Reagan, the Nancy Reagan story, which I don't believe.
Why?
It's apocryphal.
Why would I sit around and think, all right, I'm going to make up a Nancy Reagan?
Because you are Jon Meacham. Now, so
You should hear my Julia Grant stories. I don't even know what that means.
Right. So, what does it mean? I want to understand you.
Yeah. Oh, Jesus.
That's a journey from Herbert Walker Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, the Reagan before, the stuff you've written,
Yeah.
to John Lewis.
Yeah.
To write about John Lewis,
Yeah.
to publish that
Yeah.
after he goes on to glory. What do you see? Because I see a shift in accent, Jon Meacham.
Are we going to do a 50-minute hour? Do I have to pay you?
Yes.
For therapy? Yeah.
No, but talk to me about that journey
all right.
from there to here.
All right. Can I slightly reorder the question?
No.
Okay. So there is something, here's the commonality. Let's start there.
Okay.
The commonality is, these are the only two living people I've ever written about. And I didn't fall in love with either one of them, but I came to love them, which is different. They come from arguably it's hard to imagine two people beginning their lives in a more different place, right? So Poppy Bush is born on June 12th, 1924 in Milton, Massachusetts, grows up in Greenwich Country Day School, Andover, joins the United States Navy on his 18th birthday, July 12th, 1942. Is shot down on Saturday, September 2nd, 1944, over Chichijima, loses two crewmates, spent the rest of his life every day asking, why was I spared and not them? A man of immense empathy, a man of immense ambition. Those two things were in constant conflict. Ultimately, he resolved them in his mind that it mattered less what he did to amass power and more what he did when he had it. And we can argue all you want about that, but that's the way he saw it. John Lewis, great-grandson of an enslaved man, born in 1863, 62. Son of a sharecropper, overcame his childhood stutter by preaching to the chickens and on the farm in Troy. Used to say that the chickens listened to him more carefully than his colleagues in Congress ever did. And never saw a white person until he was 14, except for the mailman. Had an instinctive revulsion about segregation when he would go into town. Moved by the gospel. Very uninterested in theology, interested instead about how do you apply the Sermon on the Mount. Didn't like a preacher from Montgomery who came over and was talking about the sweet by and by. Didn't care about the sweet by and by. Wanted it right then. So radically different. My view, and you'll disagree, probably, is that they both represent parts of the American experience that I think are worth emulating and having inform what we do. George H.W. Bush was the last Eisenhower Republican, which is like saying you're the last dinosaur, right? That is dead, that party. And that party was imperfect. But I believe that one way to think about American politics and life from the New Deal until now is that it's been a figurative conversation between FDR and Reagan on the relative projection of force against commonly agreed upon foes and rivals and the relative role of the state in the marketplace. And every American president has, except for the 45th, has essentially governed on that field. And sometimes, to switch metaphors to football, sometimes, there's a George W. Bush who's over with Ronald Reagan on the 20. Sometimes there's a Lyndon Johnson over here with FDR. I've run this by Bush, Clinton, and President Obama. They all agree. President Obama agrees with the concept that that was the dialectic in which he governed. It was not a dialectic that has delivered the results I think many people want, which is one of the reasons it fell apart in 2016, right? The shift, so I don't see that as a shift. What I do see is 4 years ago, exactly, when I was closing the Soul of America book, I believed that Trump was the fullest manifestation of our darkest impulses, but that, like Joe McCarthy, it would burn out. Not that it would go away, but that these forces ebbed and flowed. And what January 6th did, and it took me a long time to get there, is it suggested to me that there was something more permanent about this. I still think it can be okay, but I didn't foresee that. And one of the things that Eddie and I agree with, just lest you think this is a marital therapy thing, is I dislike it. I disagree, I should say, when people say about something terrible that happened, Charlottesville or something, when they say, this isn't who we are. Well, of course it's who we are. Where have you been? Right. Do you not know anything? Do you literally know no American history? And I said this a while ago, but there wasn't a once upon a time in American history, and there's not going to be a happily ever after, because this is a human enterprise. And it's why the work of folks like Eddie matters so much, because Eddie does something that I don't do, which is is a historian of both our politics, but even more importantly, of our intellectual, ambient, philosophical life. And the importance of ideas, which is what drives the Baldwin book, and even, I would say, go all the way back. If you haven't read his book, it's called Exodus with an exclamation mark. It's like Jeb, just so you know. Have you ever had that comparison? Probably no,
never.
That's what I'm here for. My work is done. Thanks, Walter. It was about the Exodus narrative and how it shaped the Black experience and the American experience. So I'm less optimistic than I was.
Right.
But I don't know. Maybe because I want to be forgiven for all the stupid things I do. Maybe I'm overly forgiving. That's possible. Maybe I just love too much.
No, that's not it. That's not it.
Does that make sense? Does that answer?
Yeah, it does. And part of what it means for me, at least, to come out of the tradition out of which I come, right, is to say to you, right, in some ways, I'm glad you finally see it.
Well, you brought me home. Yeah.
No. What I mean by that is that we both grew up in the South. It's all we have to do is cross the railroad tracks. It's all we have to do is look at our lives. Yeah. This is what you were saying, right? Yeah. This is who we are. It always has been. And some of us have had to live the burden of the contradiction.
Absolutely.
Some of us have had to endure it. Some of us have lost people. And we watch for generations a country just walk past our dead. to not give a damn about them. And so when this revelation happens, it's almost like a wonderful thing that, Americans, we want to be patted on our backs. I got it, see? Right? But it becomes in this moment of crisis, when it feels as if the experiment stands on a knife's edge, this kind of insight sets the stage, at least for me, for the possibility for us to be different, to be together differently, to be otherwise. Does that make sense? I know we're going to go to time.
It does. It does.
I knew you were going to come back.
Well, of course, since we're now in full therapy mode. But this is a really important point you've drawn out.
Yeah.
And this is where, and Eddie writes, and he was kind of attacking me in his book, but he didn't. He was sweet. He didn't do it by name.
Hold up. Let me say this. By the way, I sent him Begin Again. I was tiptoeing around my criticism of Ronald Reagan. And he said, Eddie, if you're going to criticize Reagan, go after him.
Well, you had a parenthetical saying he might have been a racist. I said, you might want to unpack that. It was literally within dashes, wasn't it?
Exactly. He's like, no, I think if you're going to do it, do it.
But that's what I do this 6 times before breakfast. Oh, I totally.
Go ahead.
So one of the things that Eddie sort of dings me for, and he just did it very gently and elegantly, is that somehow or another my view of tell me if you disagree, tell me. Yeah. Somehow or another my view of history is overly triumphalist and it's self-congratulatory for the country. I disagree because of the power of narrative. If you don't tell a story that moves people to want to replicate something that was good, then what is the point of then you're unilaterally disarming.
And my response is, what we choose to leave out of our stories reveal all too often the limits of our conceptions of justice.
Sure. Yeah.
I got applause, you did.
I know. I've sort of forgotten they're here, so I was about to curse, but I just will. Okay, but you gotta tell the story.
Right, and so part of our task, right, is that's why the blues tells a different kind of story. That's how when you cross those railroad tracks, which you guys used to do.
I yelled at you guys. That's good. That's
no,
good. That's
when
good.
you cross the railroad tracks,
yeah.
In those midnight hours, nobody could see.
Oh, see, now he's doing the preacher thing now.
Yeah,
You feel the voice begin to go.
No, but you see the move, right? There's a story that has been told. Right. It's a question of what is thought of as the major plot line and what is thought of as the subplot.
Here's a really direct question.
Sure. Then we're going to come to y'all, I promise.
Far more direct than you all might get in a forum like this usually. Is the world better off or worse off for my John Lewis book?
It's better. That's an easy question.
Is it a celebration? Is it?
No, because I know what you struggled with in that book. Yeah.
All right.
What's better off is the revelation that you just gave, right? I mean, that you just said, right?
Yeah.
And the thing is that the journey that we all make, that we all take, the path that we all take, when we end up there, right? As long as you end up there.
Yeah.
And the point that I'm making here is not to pass judgment or anything. It's to say, okay, now you see. Yeah. Okay, now let's build a new America.
Yeah.
Let's be better midwives, as it were, and give birth to a new country. And I think as Southerners, because I'm a Mississippi boy, as Southerners, we have our hands, sure. Right? We're at the heart of it, as my beloved friend Imani Perry says. We're at the heart of it. If only we would confront who we actually are. Questions?
Questions.
One question.
We have.
You can only ask one.
We've gone on so long. We have one question. Who wants to ask the question? No pressure.
We told everybody we were going to blow through the question and answer period. We did say that, though.
Don't make me call on you. Yes, sir.
Project or walk up to.
I can't hear you, sir. I'm sorry. I'm too old.
Come up to the mic, Doc. And then we're going to run, right? Because we got to go. This is high church. It's like.
Where's the incense?
Dr. Glaude, one of the things you mentioned in your book is how exhausted James Baldwin was when he went to France. And for many of us who grew up in the civil rights era, it's like we're re-experiencing it and we're exhausted. So what would be Baldwin's perspective? Would he want to stay now or would he want to flee?
So I try to avoid anticipating Jimmy's words. He wrote so many that we can actually find an answer. And one of the reasons why I wrote Begin Again is because I was suffering from a kind of debilitating despair. Right? Here we were, we had come out of Ferguson, all of these young people had risked their lives, and some of them were ending up dead, found in their cars, committing suicide, so they said. And the country responded to their efforts, their organized efforts, with the election of Donald Trump. Just as the country responded to, King's murder with the election of Richard Nixon twice. And you feel like it's a Sisyphean task, having to push this damn boulder up the hill again and again and again. Baldwin tried to commit suicide at least 3 times. Right? And No Name in the Street, published in 1972, he's coming off of one of those attempts trying to make sense of this moment because he's trying, in some ways, to tell a story that will offer resources for us to imagine how to keep struggling. So I think the way in which I came out of it is that it's not the end to which we're trying to push the boulder. The value is in the actual pushing. To invoke Talib Kweli, it's the beautiful struggle itself. And that's where meaning is found. Because if we think that we have to see the end as a precondition for our struggle for a better America, we won't make it. We won't make it. Does that make sense?